In July of 1944, while soldiers were still dying across Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 nations gathered in a remote hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war wasn't even over yet. But these men weren't there to discuss battles. They were there to divide something far more valuable: control over the future of money itself. When the conference ended 3 weeks later, the United States had pulled off one of the greatest power grabs in modern history. And most people today have no idea it even happened. This is the story of how the American dollar went from a regional currency to the undisputed king of global finance. But it's also a story about what happens when that dominance starts to slip, and whether the cracks forming today could bring the whole thing down. Before the dollar ruled, another currency sat on the throne. For more than a century, the British pound sterling was the world's money. London was the center of global trade. The British Empire controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface, and international debts were settled in pounds. Then came the First World War. Britain borrowed massively to fund the fighting. By the time it was over, the empire had transformed from the world's largest creditor nation to a debtor. The pound never fully recovered. The interwar years were chaos. Countries devalued their currencies, slapped on tariffs, and turned inward. Trust in international money collapsed, and that collapse opened the door for something new. By 1944, the United States sat in a position no country had ever occupied before. American factories had been running nonstop while Europe's were bombed to rubble. The U.S. held roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold reserves. When delegates arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel that summer, the American negotiators knew they had all the leverage. The lead British negotiator, the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes, proposed a neutral international currency. The American side, led by Harry Dexter White, pushed for something different, a system centered entirely on the dollar. White won. Under the Bretton Woods Agreement, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other major currency was pegged to the dollar. In one stroke, the U.S. became the anchor of the entire global financial system. Other countries now needed dollars to trade, to settle debts, to hold in reserve. And only America could print them. A French finance minister would later call this arrangement America's exorbitant privilege. He wasn't complimenting it. What he meant was that the United States had gained an almost unfair advantage. Other nations had to export goods, earn foreign currency, and carefully manage their balance sheets. The U.S. could simply print money, and the world had to accept it. America could run trade deficits that would have collapsed any other country. It could borrow at rates others could only dream of, because global demand for dollars never stopped. The entire planet was, in effect, subsidizing American consumption. But there was a quieter cost buried inside this privilege. When your currency is the one everyone wants, it stays strong, often too strong. American exports became more expensive abroad. Manufacturing started drifting overseas. The very advantage that made the dollar king slowly began hollowing out the industries that had built American power in the first place. For nearly 3 decades, the Bretton Woods system held together. But by the late 1960s, cracks were spreading. The U.S. was spending heavily. On the Vietnam War, on domestic programs, on a lifestyle it couldn't quite afford. Foreign governments started to notice that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, famously demanded gold in exchange for its dollars. At one point, the French literally sent a warship to New York to collect bullion. Other nations followed. The gold was draining out. Then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon made a televised announcement that changed everything. The United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold. The link that had underpinned the entire system was severed in a single evening. Many expected the dollar to collapse. Instead, something strange happened. The world kept using it anyway. And within a few years, the dollar would become even more dominant, thanks to a secret deal almost nobody talks about. In 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger brokered an agreement with Saudi Arabia. The terms were never formally published, but the arrangement became known as the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil exports in U.S. dollars, and to invest its surplus revenues in American Treasury bonds. In return, the U.S. provided military protection and political support for the Saudi regime. Soon, other oil-producing nations followed Saudi Arabia's lead. Oil was the lifeblood of the industrial world, and now it could only be purchased in one currency. Every country on Earth, regardless of its relationship with America, suddenly needed a constant supply of dollars just to keep the lights on. This wasn't about economics anymore. It was structural. The petrodollar created permanent, inescapable demand for the American currency. Demand that had nothing to do with faith in America's economy and everything to do with the mechanics of global energy. But dominance built on trust can crack when trust fades. By the late 1970s, the dollar was in serious trouble. Inflation in the U.S. had reached 15%. The price of gold soared past $800 an ounce as investors fled paper money. Foreign central banks watched their dollar reserves lose value month after month, and talk of the dollar's collapse was everywhere. Then came Paul Volcker. Appointed as chairman of the Federal Reserve, Volcker did what no one expected. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%, levels that would be unimaginable today. The result was immediate and brutal. Unemployment surged, businesses failed. Farmers drove their tractors to Washington in protest. But inflation broke. And more importantly, the world saw that the United States was willing to endure real pain to defend its currency. Faith in the dollar was restored. The crisis passed. But what it revealed was critical. The dollar's power isn't automatic. It must constantly be defended. Over the decades, challengers have emerged, and each one has failed to take the throne. The euro launched in 1999 with enormous ambition. Some analysts predicted it would rival or even replace the dollar within a generation. But the eurozone's design had a fatal flaw: a shared currency without a shared fiscal policy. The debt crises that followed, Greece, Portugal, Spain, exposed the cracks. The euro stabilized, but it never truly threatened dollar dominance. Then there's China. The yuan has grown in international trade, and Beijing has pushed for more countries to settle transactions in its currency. But China maintains strict capital controls. Money can't flow freely in and out. And no currency with those restrictions has ever become a true global reserve. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now others, have talked openly about creating an alternative to the dollar, but talk is easy. Building the institutions, the trust, and the liquidity to replace the dollar would take decades. The truth is, the dollar's biggest threat isn't a rival currency. It may be America itself. Here's where the story takes a darker turn. For decades, the United States benefited from the dollar's neutrality. Countries trusted that holding dollars was safe, that the U.S. wouldn't use its currency as a weapon. That changed. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. froze hundreds of billions in Russian central bank reserves. It was an extraordinary move, and it sent a clear signal to the rest of the world. If you cross Washington, your dollars might not really be yours. The immediate effect was devastating for Russia. But the secondary effect is still unfolding. Countries that once saw dollar reserves as untouchable now see them as a potential liability. Central banks have responded by doing something they haven't done in decades: buying gold. In recent years, global gold purchases by central banks hit their highest levels since the 1960s. China, Russia, India, Turkey, all are stockpiling bullion. They're not doing this because they love gold. They're doing it because gold can't be frozen by a foreign government. Meanwhile, America's debt continues to climb. $34 trillion and rising. Interest payments alone now consume a growing share of the federal budget. None of this has triggered a crisis. Yet. But the pattern is familiar. The same pattern that preceded the fall of the pound, and the currencies that came before it. every reserve currency in history has eventually fallen. The Spanish dollar, the Dutch guilder, the British pound, each dominated for a time, and each eventually gave way. The American dollar has now held supremacy for 80 years, longer than most. But that doesn't mean forever. The dollar wasn't crowned by destiny. It was engineered through leverage, through war, through deals made in secret rooms, and through the willingness to project military power across the globe. Its survival depends not just on America's economy, but on trust. Trust that is quietly eroding in places most Americans never see. The question isn't really if the dollar will one day lose its throne. History says it will. The real question is what comes next, and whether the transition will be gradual or sudden. For now, the dollar remains king, but kings don't last forever, and the world is already preparing for what comes after.